The Seerah of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, part 35. So Mubazan, the minister of the king of Persia, the Kisra, he sees a dream. What's the dream that he sees? He sees on the night preceding the birth of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the night before Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was born, Mubazan, the minister of Kisra, saw a dream that there are some very strong Arabian camels racing ahead, and behind them there are some Arabian horses racing until they come to the river Tigris, which is a famous river in Iraq. In Iraq there are two famous rivers that run through Iraq. One is the Euphrates and the other is the Tigris. The Tigris is known as the Dajla River, and so he sees that these camels and horses come upon the river Tigris and they enter the river, they run across it and they come out the other side, and then they spread out into the whole world and they reach every country. So this was such a strong and a vivid dream. You know, sometimes when you have a really clear, strong dream, when you wake up, then it either surprises you or terrifies you or makes you happy. So this was an unusual dream. Mubazan woke up and he was troubled by this dream. He knew that this dream means something. And in the meantime, that same night, the palace of the Kisra had shaken, and it wasn't as if the whole country was hit by an earthquake. It was just that the palace of Kisra shook. Nothing else shook. It was just his palace. And he had many minarets, and 14 of those minarets of that palace, they tumbled down to the ground. So Kisra in the morning, he assembles his court and he calls all his ministers and he calls Mubazan also. Now that night, I've mentioned that there were 5 irhasat in that same night, the night before Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was born. One was the shaking of the palace, and the other was a tumbling of the minarets, and the third was the lake of Sawa drying up, and the fourth was the 1,000-year-old fire becoming extinguished all of a sudden, and the fifth one is the dream of Mubazan. Now Kisra, he only knew about the shaking of the palace and the tumbling of the towers because he was in the palace that night, and he knew about the lake of Sawa drying up. News of that had also reached him, but he didn't know about the other two things, about the fire becoming extinguished and about Mubazan's dream. So Kisra, just because of these 3 things that he knows about, the shaking of the palace and the falling of the minarets and the drying up of the lake, he is troubled and terrified by this. If you can imagine, one morning we wake up and we find out that in the world an earthquake has taken place, for example. That troubles us. But if we find out that like there's been an earthquake somewhere and there's been something else somewhere else and something else, then it gets you worried that, you know, something's happening, maybe Qiyamah's coming. So like that, Kisra knew that something was happening. He'd had a very troubled night, so he woke up, he'd hardly slept. He collected his court and he asked them that, you know why I've collected you? No, Your Royal Highness, we don't know. So he said, listen, last night 3 strange things happened. The shaking, my palace shook, and the minarets came tumbling to the ground. All of them did not collapse, only 14 of them came down. So that's a sign as well. And why did the quake only hit my palace? Why not the rest of the country? So this is very strange, he's saying. And then he says that, and also news has reached me that the Sawa lake has dried up all of a sudden. Just as he's having this conversation, news reaches him. Somebody comes and tells him that, Your Royal Highness, the fire in our temple has become extinguished. What do you mean it's become extinguished? Is it because I think I've mentioned before that they had employed thousands of people to maintain that fire, make sure it wouldn't go out. And their system was so good for 1,000 years, the fire just hadn't become extinguished. So they told him that the fire has become extinguished. What do you mean it's become extinguished? What do you mean it's gone out? Did you people not put enough fuel into it? They said, no, Your Royal Highness, it wasn't anything like that. There was loads of fuel, loads of wood in there, but all of a sudden it just went out last night. So now Kisra is even more terrified. He's clutching his head. He's saying, what's going on? And just then, Mubazaans stands up. Mubazaans is his trusted minister. Kisra thought that Mubazaans is going to answer my question, but instead he added fuel to the fire, so to speak. He said, Your Royal Highness, if you permit me, I'd like to relate a dream. He said, what is it? He said, last night I saw this very vivid, powerful dream. And then he related his dream of the camels and the horses racing and entering the river and coming out of the river and spreading out throughout the whole world. So now Kisra is even more perturbed and worried and anxious and terrified, and he's like, what's going on? He asked Mubazaans, what's going on? So Mubazaans said, well, I think that something is going to happen in Arabia, or something has already happened in Arabia. That was Mubazaans' judgment. So then Kisra immediately wrote a letter to one of his ministers, and he said that send me the biggest alim, the biggest scholar that we have in this kingdom. And so there was a scholar called Abdul Masih. He was a great scholar, Zoroastrian fire-worshipping scholar. So he came to the court of Kisra. And so Kisra asked Abdul Masih about all of this. He said, listen, these things have happened. And he told him about the 5 irhasad. He said, all this has happened in one night. What's going on? So Abdul Masih said, I'm sorry, Your Royal Highness, I can't answer your question. I don't have that much knowledge. But I do have an uncle, my mum's brother, my mamu, who lives in Syria, and I can go and ask him, and he's a soothsayer, and he will know. And so Kisra tells Abdul Masih to go there immediately, and then Abdul Masih sets off on a very fast horse, and he heads immediately towards Syria to meet his uncle, who is a famous soothsayer. And soothsayers I've mentioned before, but now in the next recording I'll give you the lowdown on soothsayers and what their reality was. Soothsayers, kahins, fortune tellers, psychics, what they really were and what they really are. Inshallah, that's in the next recording. Allahumma salli wa sallim wa barik ala Sayyidina wa Mawlana Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'een.